Picture this. You are 17 years old when you first taste absolute power, and it tastes like copper and fear. The throne room of Tagovist stretches before you like a tomb waiting to be filled. The stone walls still weep with moisture that looks too dark, too red, in the flickering torchlight. Your father's blood has been scrubbed away, but stone remembers what cloth forgets. The boyars who murdered him stand in neat rows, their silk robes rustling like autumn leaves that refuse to fall. Their faces wear masks of respectful attention, but their eyes dart toward the exits with the nervous energy of trapped animals. You recognize each face from the nightmares that have haunted your sleep for months. Lord Aldea, whose soft hands have never held anything heavier than wine cups, yet somehow found the strength to drive a dagger between your father's ribs. Boyar Cryovescu, who smiled at your father's table while planning his betrayal in whispered conversations. These men expect gratitude now. After all, they have just handed you the crown of Wallachia, a gift wrapped in ceremony and soaked in patricide. Your Highness, the eldest boyar speaks, his voice like honey poured over steel. We pledge our loyalty to House Draculeshti. Your father's unfortunate end shall not repeat itself under our guidance. The word guidance hangs in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. They believe you need their wisdom, their protection, their permission to rule the kingdom they have just stolen for you. But you remember being 13, chained in a Turkish dungeon, while these same men carved up your homeland like a feast day goose. You remember the lessons learned in Ottoman captivity, where you discovered that mercy is a luxury only the powerful can afford, and even then, only briefly. Your fingers find the dragon's sigil carved into your throne's armrest. Dracul, your father's name, meaning dragon in the old tongue. But the people whisper another meaning behind closed doors, devil. Perhaps they understand something about your bloodline that you are only beginning to grasp. The first execution happens 3 days later, when Lord Aldea makes the mistake of suggesting that perhaps the royal treasury might benefit from his continued oversight. You watch his face as he realizes that your silence was not agreement, but calculation. The scaffold built in the courtyard is not the quick drop of a proper hanging, but something else entirely, a tall wooden post sharpened to a cruel point, designed not for swift justice, but for lingering education. The boyar's screams echo off the castle walls for what feels like hours, though the sun barely moves in its path across the sky. You count each cry, watching his eyes transform from arrogance to disbelief to something approaching understanding. This is not the hot rage of youth or the wild fury of grief. This is something colder, more deliberate. The other nobles watch from the ramparts, their faces pale as parchment. You see the exact moment when fear replaces their condescension, when they truly comprehend who now holds power in Wallachia. But what disturbs you more than their terror is the strange satisfaction that blooms in your chest like a dark flower. The sound of Aldea's agony should horrify you. Instead, it feels like music written in a language you have always known but never spoken. Your captain of guards, a grizzled veteran named Stanchu, approaches when the screaming finally stops. My lord, the other boyars are requesting an audience. They wish to discuss terms of service. Terms? You turn the word over in your mouth like wine you are not certain you wish to swallow. Tell them the terms are simple. They serve until they die, and they die when I decide they have served enough. Stanchu's weathered face remains carefully neutral, but you catch something in his eyes, not fear, exactly, but recognition. He has seen this transformation before, in other young rulers who discovered that power tastes sweeter when seasoned with blood. That night, alone in your chambers, you stare at your reflection in the polished bronze mirror that belonged to your father. The face looking back seems familiar yet strange, as if you are seeing yourself through water. The boy who was dragged to Ottoman courts as hostage security is gone. In his place stands someone harder, someone who understands that survival requires embracing methods that would have once made you sick. You think of your brother, Radu, polished into the Sultan's favored protege, proof that loyalty can be purchased as easily as fear. He chose one path to power seduction, charm, willing collaboration. You have chosen another. Both paths lead to the same destination, but yours requires walking through valleys that decent men avoid. The candle burns lower as you contemplate the lessons learned in Turkish captivity. Sultan Mehmed had not ruled the greatest empire in the world through kindness or democratic consensus. He had built his power on the absolute certainty that disobedience meant death, and that the manner of dying could be adjusted to send precisely the message required. Tomorrow there will be another execution, and another after that, until the lesson is fully learned. But tonight, in the flickering candlelight, you wonder if the cost of teaching these lessons might be higher than you yet understand. The workshop behind your castle becomes a place where nightmares are crafted with the precision of fine furniture. You have become a student of suffering, and the curriculum requires careful attention to detail. Master Radu, not your brother, but the carpenter, whose hands shape wood into instruments of education, stands before you with sawdust in his beard and uncertainty in his eyes. The man has built chairs for kings and altars for churches, but the commission you have given him requires skills that no guild teaches. "My lord," he begins, his calloused fingers turning his cap in nervous circles. "The stakes you have requested. They require very specific measurements." You study the wooden implements laid across his workbench, like a surgeon examining his tools. Each piece tells a story of deliberate cruelty stakes shaped to penetrate slowly, allowing gravity to draw victims downward over hours rather than minutes. The blunt tips are not accidents, but careful design choices, calculated to prolong the educational value of each execution. "Show me the differences," you command, lifting one of the implements. The wood is smooth under your palm, polished to prevent splinters that might cause merciful unconsciousness too quickly. Master Radu clears his throat nervously. "This one here, my lord, shaped with a broader tip, it allows for longer instruction periods. The victim remains aware throughout most of the process. This thinner one provides quicker resolution, perhaps an hour at most." You nod, understanding completely. This is not random violence, but systematic communication. Each stake sends a different message, designed for specific audiences. The merchants who cheat on taxes require one type of lesson. The boyars who plot rebellion need another entirely. The first forest of the impaled rises outside Brasov, where Saxon merchants dared to conduct trade without paying proper tribute to your crown. You personally supervise the positioning of each stake, arranging them in patterns that can be seen from the mountain passes, where future traders will witness the results of dishonest business practices. The sound carries for miles, hundreds of voices raised in a chorus of instruction that echoes off the valley walls. Merchants traveling the trade routes will hear these lessons long before they see them, giving them ample time to consider whether their own business practices meet your standards. Bogdan, your chief executioner, was once an Ottoman prisoner who learned his skills in the Sultan's service. His hands remain steady as he positions each victim with the precision of a master craftsman. "My lord," he says during a brief pause in the work, "some of the men are asking if there might be more efficient methods available." You walk among the stakes, observing the expressions of those who still possess the strength for facial movement. Fear, yes, but also understanding. These men comprehend exactly why they are dying and what their deaths will teach others. This clarity of communication is worth more than efficiency. "Efficient methods teach nothing, Bogdan," you reply, adjusting the angle of a stake that has not achieved optimal positioning. These men carry lessons that will travel to every trading post between here and Constantinople. Their voices speak louder than any royal decree. A Hungarian merchant named Andreas, one of the few who conducted honest business, and thus earns the privilege of witness rather than participation watches from the designated safe distance. His face is turned the color of spoiled milk, but his eyes remain fixed on the display. You approach him with the casual manner of a host showing off his gardens. "You seem troubled by our methods of justice," you observe. Andreas swallows hard before answering. "My lord, surely such elaborate punishments are unnecessary for simple tax evasion." "Simple?" You gesture toward the forest of educational materials surrounding you both. There is nothing simple about systematic theft from the royal treasury. These men stole not just gold, but the security of every honest subject in Wallachia. Their punishment must match the scope of their crime. The merchant nods rapidly, perhaps understanding that disagreement with your educational philosophy might result in more practical instruction than he desires. "Of course, my lord. The lesson is very clear." Later that evening, you dine in your castle's great hall, while the windows remain open to the night air. The sounds from outside provide a backdrop to the meal, a reminder that justice continues its work even while you rest. Your food tastes better with this accompaniment, though you cannot entirely explain why. Your Captain Stanciu joins you at table, his expression carefully neutral as always. "My lord, word of today's instruction has already reached the Hungarian border. Merchants are adjusting their routes to avoid our territory." "Good," you reply, cutting another piece of meat. "Let them tell their friends what happens to those who steal from Wallachia. Better they learn from observation than experience." But as the meal continues and the sounds from outside gradually fade, you notice something unsettling. The satisfaction you feel, the deep, warm pleasure that comes from perfectly executed justice, seems to grow stronger with each lesson taught. What began as necessary political calculation has become something approaching appetite. The thought should disturb you more than it does. Instead, you find yourself already planning tomorrow's educational activities, considering which of the remaining boyars might benefit from practical instruction in loyalty. The line between justice and cruelty blurs a little more with each passing day, but clarity feels less important than results. Outside, the last voices fade into silence, leaving only the sound of wind through the forest you have planted. Soon, very soon, all of Europe will understand what it means to cross the dragon's sun. The Ottoman ambassadors arrive like peacocks, displaying their finest feathers, completely unaware they have walked into a spider's web. Their silk turbans catch the morning sunlight streaming through your courtyard, gleaming like jewels that will soon be permanently attached to their skulls. You watch them from the shadows of the great hall as they dismount from their horses with the casual confidence of men who have never truly been denied anything. These are not mere messengers, but high-ranking officials, representing Sultan Mehmed himself, men accustomed to having doors opened, knees bent, and tributes delivered with apologetic smiles. Their leader, a man whose soft hands have never gripped anything more dangerous than a wine cup, approaches with that particular swagger that comes from representing the world's most powerful empire. His name is Hamza Pasha, and his eyes hold the lazy cruelty of someone who has watched lesser men grovel for his amusement. "We bring greetings from His Imperial Majesty, Sultan Mehmed II, conqueror of Constantinople," he announces, his voice carrying across the courtyard like a proclamation. "We come to discuss your kingdom's tribute obligations and your continued cooperation." Quote, the word cooperation drips from his tongue like honey laced with poison. You recognize the tone from your own captivity years, the sound of masters addressing their property. But those days are buried deeper than your father's bones, and these men have made the fatal mistake of treating you like the hostage boy you once were. Enter, you reply simply, gesturing toward the great hall. We shall discuss these matters with the attention they deserve. The ceremonial greeting unfolds exactly as protocol demands. Wine is served in your finest goblets, bread broken according to tradition, the ancient rituals of hospitality observed with meticulous care. The ambassadors relax slightly, perhaps assuming that the stories they have heard about your methods were mere propaganda designed to inflate your reputation. Your Sultan's demands, Hamza Pasha begins, unrolling a scroll with theatrical flourish, include an increase in annual tribute to account for inflation and administrative costs. Furthermore, His Imperial Majesty requires renewed assurances of Walachia's loyalty and the immediate cessation of raids against Ottoman territories. You listen to each word while studying the faces around the table. These men have delivered such ultimatums to dozens of client rulers, watching kings and princes scramble to meet impossible demands rather than face the alternative. Their expressions hold that particular satisfaction of predators who have cornered their prey. And if these terms prove difficult to accept, you ask, your voice carrying no more emotion than if you were discussing the weather. His Imperial Majesty hopes such difficulties will not arise. The second ambassador interjects with a smile that never reaches his eyes. Past rulers who struggled with these arrangements found the alternatives quite unpleasant. The threat hangs in the air, like smoke from a funeral pyre. You recognize the dance, the careful steps of diplomatic extortion performed by men who have refined the art across conquered territories. But they have miscalculated something fundamental about their audience. I understand completely, you reply, rising from your chair with deliberate calm. However, before we proceed, I must ask you to remove your turbans in my presence. Local custom, you understand. The request strikes them like a physical blow. Hamza Pasha's face darkens with indignation, his soft features hardening into something approaching genuine anger. Impossible. Our faith forbids such disrespect to sacred garments. Surely you would not ask us to violate religious law. I would never dream of asking you to violate anything sacred, you respond, your voice carrying the gentle tone of someone offering comfort to a child. Your turbans are clearly so important to you that removal would cause genuine suffering. Therefore, I shall ensure they never need to be removed again. The silence that follows seems to stretch for hours, though the shadows on the wall barely shift. The ambassadors exchange glances, perhaps sensing that something has shifted in the conversation, but unable to identify exactly what. My lord, Hamza Pasha begins carefully, we appreciate your understanding of our religious obligations. Understanding is precisely what I offer, you reply, then raise your hand in a simple gesture. The doors to the great hall slam shut with the finality of tomb seals. Your guards, positioned throughout the room with the casual invisibility of furniture, suddenly become very visible indeed. The ambassadors' expressions transform from confusion to alarm to something approaching comprehension as they realize that diplomatic immunity is not a universal concept. What is the meaning of this? The second ambassador demands, his voice rising with panic that he tries unsuccessfully to disguise as outrage. You said your turbans were too sacred to remove. You explain with the patience of a teacher addressing particularly slow students. I am simply ensuring they remain permanently attached to their rightful owners. The hammering begins before they can scream. Your blacksmith, Pavel, enters carrying tools more commonly used for horseshoes than human heads. But craftsmanship is craftsmanship, regardless of the medium. The long iron spikes he has prepared are perfectly sized for the task, thin enough to penetrate skull bone, long enough to ensure complete attachment, shaped to avoid immediate death while guaranteeing permanent installation. Hamza Pasha tries to run, his diplomatic dignity abandoned in favor of basic survival instinct. But your guards have been chosen for competence rather than mercy, and his soft merchant's body proves no match for men who have spent their lives training for violence. The first nail goes through turban and skull with a sound like splitting wood. Hamza's scream cuts through the air like a blade, high and pure and utterly hopeless. The second ambassador attempts to bargain, offering gold and territorial concessions and anything else that might stay the hammering. But his words dissolve into incoherent pleading as Pavel adjusts his aim. You watch with clinical interest as sacred headwear becomes permanently integrated with the skulls of its wearers. The irony is not lost on you. They claimed religious reasons for keeping their turbans attached, and now they will never be separated from their sacred garments again. But death by hammer would be too quick, too merciful for men who came to your court expecting submission. These ambassadors represent more than themselves. They are the face of an empire that held you captive, that treats sovereign nations like wayward children, requiring discipline. Prepare the stakes. You command, your voice carrying no more emotion than if you were ordering dinner. Let these gentlemen experience the full hospitality that Wallachia offers to guests who mistake courtesy for weakness. The impalement takes place in the main courtyard, positioned so that anyone approaching the castle must witness your response to Ottoman diplomacy. The ambassadors, still wearing their iron-spiked turbans, provide an excellent demonstration of what happens when sacred obligations meet practical politics. You dine that evening on the castle ramparts, where the sounds from below provide pleasant accompaniment to your meal. The wine tastes particularly fine tonight, though you cannot say whether this is due to the vintage or the circumstances. A young Ottoman scribe, deliberately spared to serve as messenger, kneels at a respectful distance, his face pale as parchment and his hands shaking like autumn leaves. What message shall I carry to His Imperial Majesty? He whispers. You consider the question while cutting another piece of meat, listening to the educational chorus echoing from the courtyard below. Tell Sultan Mehmed that his tribute request has been received and answered in full. Tell him that Wallachia's cooperation will be provided exactly as his ambassadors have experienced it. The scribe nods rapidly, perhaps understanding that survival depends on accurate message delivery. As he hurries away into the darkness, you reflect on the evening's successful diplomacy. Tomorrow, word will spread throughout the Ottoman Empire about what transpired at your court tonight. Future diplomatic missions will approach with significantly more caution, if they approach at all. The language of fear, you have discovered, translates perfectly across all cultural boundaries. The horizon burns with the dust of an approaching army, so vast that it seems to swallow the very sky. Sultan Mehmed's response to your diplomatic message arrives not in words but in the thunder of hoofbeats from 90,000 warriors, though some reports claim 300,000, and Mehmed himself boasted of fielding 150,000 veterans of Constantinople's conquest. You stand on the walls of Targovishte, watching the distant cloud grow larger with each passing hour. This is not merely an army, but the concentrated fury of the world's most powerful empire, assembled for the sole purpose of teaching you what happens to princes who nail turbans to ambassadors' skulls. My lord, Captain Stanchu reports, his weathered face grim as carved stone. Our scouts estimate their numbers at more than all the men in Wallachia combined. Every village, every town, every able-bodied man in our kingdom could not match a tenth of their force. You nod, understanding the mathematics of destruction bearing down on your realm. Traditional military wisdom would demand immediate surrender, perhaps followed by ritualized groveling and the payment of tribute so enormous that your kingdom would remain impoverished for generations. But traditional wisdom assumes traditional rulers, and you abandoned such conventional thinking the day you discovered that fear could be more effective than friendship. Send riders to every settlement. You command, your voice carrying across the battlements like winter wind. Tell them that war has come to Wallachia, and that war in our land follows different rules than anywhere else on earth. The orders that follow transform your kingdom into something that would be unrecognizable to the farmers and merchants who called it home just days before. Every village receives the same instructions. Evacuate all civilians to prepared strongholds. Burn everything that cannot be moved. Poison every well with materials that will leave no doubt about their contamination. But simple destruction would be insufficient to achieve your objectives. The Ottoman army has conquered territories from the gates of Vienna to the shores of the Black Sea. Burned villages and poisoned wells are familiar obstacles, easily overcome by competent logistics. You require something more memorable, more personally disturbing to the men who must march through your transformed landscape. The first village they encounter appears normal from a distance, exactly as you intended. Smoke still rises from chimneys where fires burn unattended, and figures can be seen moving through the streets in what appears to be normal daily activity. Only when the Ottoman advance guard enters the settlement do they discover that every apparent resident has been carefully positioned on stakes, arranged to create the illusion of life until viewed at close range. The blacksmith stands at his forge, impaled but positioned so that his body appears to be working the bellows. The baker remains at his ovens, though the bread cooking inside has been replaced with materials that will never nourish anyone. Women hang laundry that flutters in the breeze, their bodies supported by stakes that emerge from their backs at angles carefully calculated to maintain the appearance of normal household activity. Through your network of hidden observers, you watch Ottoman soldiers discover the truth about this pastoral scene. Hardened warriors who have sacked cities across 3 continents stumble from house to house, their faces green as spring grass, as they realize that even the livestock has been impaled and positioned to mimic ordinary farm life. The deception is effective, reports your spy master, a thin man whose skills at remaining invisible have served you well. Their advance has slowed considerably. Some units are refusing orders to enter Wallachian territory. This is the true victory you sought, not the destruction of an army you could never defeat in open battle, but the psychological fracture, spreading through enemy ranks like plague through a crowded city. Fear travels faster than the swiftest cavalry, and you have weaponized terror more efficiently than any siege engine ever constructed. The systematic contamination of your own territory continues according to carefully planned schedules. Wells receive not merely poison, but visual elements designed to maximize psychological impact. The decomposing bodies of impaled victims lowered into water supplies, ensuring that even the most basic necessity of life carries reminders of your methods. Granaries that appear full from outside reveal their true contents only when opened. Human remains, arranged with the same meticulous care that your gardeners once applied to flower beds. Food stores that might sustain an advancing army instead provide educational displays about the price of invasion. Each prepared horror serves multiple purposes. The immediate effect slows the Ottoman advance as commanders struggle to maintain discipline among troops confronting atrocities that exceed their considerable experience with warfare's brutalities. The longer-term impact will be felt in Constantinople's recruiting stations, where stories of Wallachian campaigns will make future military service in your territory distinctly unappealing. But your masterpiece awaits outside Targovishte itself, where you have prepared a reception that will test whether the conqueror of Constantinople possesses the stomach for the type of warfare you have perfected. The forest of the impaled rises like a monument to systematic terror, visible from miles away across the open countryside. Contemporary accounts will later claim 20,000 victims, arranged in geometric patterns that seem to stretch beyond the horizon, though exact numbers matter less than psychological impact. You personally supervised the positioning of each stake, ensuring optimal visibility from all approaches to the city. The victims captured Ottoman soldiers from previous raids, Wallachian collaborators, criminals whose offenses provided convenient justification have been arranged in concentric circles that draw the eye inexorably inward toward the city gates. The display represents months of careful preparation, each element calculated for maximum educational value. Some victims were positioned to face the direction of Ottoman approach, their expressions frozen in final moments of agony, serving as welcome signs for Mehmed's advancing army. Others were arranged to create visual patterns that only become apparent from elevated positions, transforming human suffering into artistic statement. The sounds carry for miles not the quick screams of battlefield death, but the prolonged educational chorus of impalement victims in various stages of their instructional process. Some voices still call out warnings to approaching soldiers, while others have progressed beyond speech into purely animal expressions of suffering. When Sultan Mehmed's advance scouts first encounter your masterwork, their reports cause the entire army to halt its approach. These are veterans who have witnessed the sack of Constantinople, who have seen warfare's most extreme expressions. Yet their descriptions of your forest cause even Mehmed himself to ride forward for personal inspection. You watch from concealment as the man who conquered the greatest city in Christendom surveys your artistic achievement. His face, normally impassive as carved marble, shows the first cracks of uncertainty as he comprehends the scale and systematic nature of what confronts his army. The silence stretches for long minutes as Mehmed processes the implications of continuing his advance through territory where warfare has been redefined according to principles that exceed even Ottoman standards of acceptable brutality. His reputation was built on military victories achieved through superior numbers and logistics, not on willingness to match the creative cruelty of opponents who view human suffering as raw material for psychological warfare. The decision, when it comes, represents a strategic victory worth more than any battlefield triumph your limited forces could have achieved through conventional means. Instead of pressing forward to crush your rebellion through overwhelming force, Mehmed chooses tactical withdrawal, combined with political substitution, installing your brother Radu as client prince while avoiding the costs associated with extended campaign through your transformed territory. As the Ottoman army begins its strategic redeployment, you reflect on lessons learned about the relationship between reputation and military effectiveness. Traditional armies require supplies, reinforcements, and favorable terrain. The army of fear requires only imagination and willingness to abandon conventional moral constraints. But victory through horror carries hidden costs that will not become apparent until much later. The methods that saved your kingdom from Ottoman conquest have also transformed you into something that even your allies will eventually find too dangerous to support. The dragon's fire that burns enemies will ultimately consume everything within reach, including those it was meant to protect. The forest of the impaled will stand for weeks, serving as monument to your tactical genius and warning of psychological prices that must be paid for such innovations in the art of warfare. The Hungarian castle that becomes your prison feels like a tomb built for the living, its comfortable chambers more suffocating than any dungeon chains. King Matthias Corvinus visits on the first Tuesday of each month, his footsteps echoing through corridors that have become the boundaries of your shrinking world. The irony cuts deeper than any blade. The man who once celebrated your victories against Ottoman expansion now treats you like a rabid dog that must be kept comfortable but contained. Your former ally enters your chambers with the careful movements of someone approaching a dangerous animal, his eyes never quite meeting yours directly. "You understand our position, Vlad," he begins, settling into the chair, positioned precisely beyond arm's reach. "The use of your given name instead of your title carries its own message. You are no longer a ruler, but a problem requiring management." "I understand perfectly," you reply, watching dust motes dance in the afternoon sunlight streaming through barred windows. Your diplomatic relations with the Ottoman Empire have become more valuable than your alliance with a Christian prince who actually fights them. Matthias flinches slightly at the accusation, though his expression remains diplomatically neutral. Your methods, while effective in the short term, have created complications for our broader strategic objectives. The stories emerging from your campaigns exceed what our allies can publicly support. The word stories hangs between you like smoke from a funeral pyre. You know exactly which accounts have reached European courts, German pamphlets describing your dining habits among the impaled, Hungarian diplomatic reports detailing the turban incident, Ottoman survivors spreading testimony about warfare that exceeded even their empire's considerable tolerance for brutality. Stories, you repeat, tasting the word like wine gone sour. Tell me, Matthias, which parts do they consider excessive? The prevention of Ottoman expansion into Christian territory, the elimination of corrupt nobles who murdered my father, the establishment of trade policies that actually benefit Wallachia instead of foreign merchants? The manner of execution, he responds quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a man who has seen too much documentation. The systematic nature of the suffering, the apparent enthusiasm with which you personally supervise these activities. Through the window, you can see Hungarian peasants working fields that have never known the threat of Ottoman raids, never felt the terror of Turkish slave-gathering expeditions. Their safety was purchased with Wallachian blood and methods that Matthias now finds politically inconvenient. Years pass in this limbo between freedom and captivity. Historians will later debate whether 8 or 12, as if the exact duration matters more than the psychological erosion that occurs within any cage, however gilded. Letters arrive sporadically, carried by merchants whose faces grow increasingly uncomfortable as they deliver news from your former kingdom. Your brother Radu has instituted new trade agreements with Constantinople, one merchant reports, his eyes focused on the floor rather than your face. The boyars have returned to their traditional flexibility regarding tribute payments. Commerce flows freely without the previous complications. Each euphemism strikes like a physical blow. Flexibility means submission to Ottoman demands. Commerce flowing freely means your people are once again treated as resources to be harvested rather than citizens to be protected. The systematic fear that maintained Wallachia's independence has evaporated like morning mist, leaving behind the familiar patterns of exploitation that your methods had temporarily interrupted. But the stories have acquired lives independent of their historical source. German printing presses produce increasingly elaborate accounts of your reign, each edition more sensational than the last. You read these publications with the detached fascination of someone observing their own transformation into mythology. One pamphlet shows you dining at a table surrounded by impaled victims, their faces twisted in eternal agony while you raise a wine cup in toast to their suffering. The image captures something essential about your methods, though the context has been stripped away completely. What was once calculated psychological warfare designed to protect your kingdom has become evidence of supernatural malevolence. Another publication describes you as a creature who drinks human blood and commands wolves, embellishments that would be laughable if they were not gradually replacing historical fact in popular imagination. The man who used systematic terror as a tool of statecraft is disappearing behind a monster whose cruelty serves no purpose beyond personal satisfaction. Father Stephan, the castle chaplain assigned to provide spiritual comfort attempts conversation during your daily walks through the courtyard. His face carries the particular strain of someone trying to save a soul he is not certain deserves salvation. "Do you ever experience remorse, my lord?" he asks during one autumn afternoon, his breath visible in the cooling air. "For the methods you employed, for the suffering you caused?" The question assumes you possessed alternatives that simply did not exist. Remorse is a luxury available only to those whose choices included options that would have achieved the same objectives through gentler means. Your kingdom faced systematic exploitation by enemies, betrayal by allies, and internal rebellion by nobles who preferred foreign gold to domestic stability. "Regret is for those who had better choices available, Father," you reply. "Watching leaves fall from trees that will survive the winter while stronger things perish. I used the tools necessary to achieve objectives that could not have been accomplished through prayer and diplomacy. But surely," Father Stephen persists, "some accommodation could have been reached, some compromise that would have avoided such extreme measures." You stop walking, turning to face the priest with an expression that makes him step backward involuntarily. "Tell me, Father, what compromises did Christ make with those who nailed him to wood? What diplomatic solutions did the martyrs negotiate with their persecutors?" The comparison disturbs him visibly, as you intended. The parallel between religious sacrifice and political necessity makes him uncomfortable in ways he cannot articulate, forcing him to confront questions about the relationship between moral purity and practical effectiveness that most clergy prefer to avoid. Alone in your chambers at night, when candlelight creates dancing shadows on stone walls, you sometimes hear echoes of sounds that exist now only in memory. The forest of the impaled has long since returned to ordinary woodland, but your mind preserves what physical evidence cannot. The question is not whether you feel remorse, but whether the methods that saved your kingdom justify their cost to your soul, a calculation that becomes more complex with each passing year of imprisonment. Sleep brings dreams of stakes arranged in perfect geometric patterns, of diplomatic negotiations concluded with hammers and iron spikes, of Ottoman armies turning away from territory they could have conquered but chose to avoid. In these visions, you sometimes cannot tell whether you are the architect of necessary justice or the creator of systematic horror. Perhaps the distinction matters less than you once believed. The transformation from ruler to legend continues without your participation, carried forward by storytellers who have never seen Wallachia but understand that audiences prefer simple monsters to complex political actors. The man who wielded terror as a precision instrument is disappearing behind tales of supernatural evil that serve no purpose beyond entertainment. Your legacy is being rewritten by people who were never forced to choose between their kingdom's survival and their personal moral comfort, who have never discovered what methods become acceptable when gentler approaches prove insufficient. The dragon is becoming myth, while its creator watches helplessly from behind gilded bars. The messenger who brings news of your restoration to power cannot meet your eyes when he delivers the invitation that will define your final act. King Matthias needs you again. Ottoman pressure has intensified. Wallachia requires experienced leadership, and your reputation remains the most effective deterrent in Christendom's increasingly limited arsenal. His Majesty hopes. The messenger stammers, his voice barely above a whisper, that your previous methods might be employed with greater discretion in future campaigns. The word discretion tastes like ash in your mouth. After years of imprisonment justified by your excessive brutality, they now require that same brutality delivered with political palatability. The dragon they caged for being too dangerous must now breathe fire on command, but only when the flames serve Hungarian diplomatic objectives. Standing once again in the courtyard of Targovishte Castle, You survey stones that still remember the blood spilled decades earlier. The physical stains have long since been scrubbed away, but memory preserves what cloth and soap cannot touch. Young men who were not born when your reign of terror began now serve as guards, their faces showing the nervous respect due to legends they hope never to see proven true. A delegation of boyars approaches with carefully measured steps, sons and grandsons of men you once impaled, their inherited caution seasoned by stories passed down through generations of whispered warnings. They offer loyalty with the practiced precision of people who have learned to navigate the presence of predators. "My lord," their spokesman begins, his voice carrying the studied neutrality of someone addressing a potentially explosive device. "How shall we proceed with establishing your authority?" The people remember your previous methods of governance. The old answer would have involved stakes and screaming, forests of educational displays visible from neighboring kingdoms. But repetition dulls even the sharpest blade, and terror, like any tool, loses effectiveness through overuse. The methods that once seemed revolutionary now feel like reflexive responses to challenges that perhaps require more sophisticated solutions. Yet when Turkish raiders probe your borders within days of your return, muscle memory takes control before conscious thought can intervene. The surviving attackers find themselves arranged along the frontier in the traditional manner, their bodies serving notice that some things remain unchanged despite the passage of years. You observe the familiar process with the detachment of someone watching actors perform a play they have seen countless times. The systematic positioning of stakes, the careful calculation of angles to maximize both suffering and visibility, the precise timing required to ensure educational value exceeds mere revenge. These skills return as naturally as breathing. But something has shifted in the audience's reaction. The local population watches your renewed displays of justice with expressions that mix fear with something approaching boredom. They have adapted to living with monsters, developing psychological calluses that protect them from the full impact of horrors that once paralyzed entire regions with terror. Your Captain Bogdan, now gray-haired and slower in his movements but still competent with hammer and stake, approaches with the measured gait of someone who has spent too many years in your service. "My lord, the Turkish survivors have been positioned according to your specifications. Shall we prepare additional materials for future educational opportunities?" The question reveals more than its speaker intended. Even your most loyal executioners have begun treating systematic torture as routine administrative duty, rather than the calculated psychological warfare it was designed to be. The innovation that once terrorized empires has devolved into bureaucratic procedure. A Hungarian merchant traveling the trade routes stops at your court, his face carrying the particular pallor of someone who has witnessed your handiwork but must conduct business regardless of personal comfort. "My lord, I bring greetings from King Matthias and news of Ottoman movements along the southern borders." "And what do you think of our methods of frontier security?" you ask, gesturing toward the display of impaled raiders visible through the great hall windows. The merchant swallows hard before responding with diplomatic care. "Your reputation for thoroughness remains well established throughout the region, though some merchants now prefer alternative routes that avoid potential complications." The admission cuts deeper than intended. Your methods, designed to protect Wallachian commerce by deterring foreign raids, have become so notorious that honest traders avoid your territory entirely. The cure has become worse than the disease it was meant to address. Winter arrives early that year, bringing with it the kind of bone-deep cold that makes even healthy men contemplate mortality. The raids along your borders intensify as Ottoman commanders test whether your restored rule carries the same deterrent effect as your earlier reign. Their probing attacks suggest that your reputation, while still fearsome, no longer carries the paralyzing terror it once inspired. The final skirmish near Bucharest unfolds with the chaotic randomness that characterizes all warfare cavalry charges, dissolving into individual combat, strategic plans abandoned for immediate survival, noble purposes reduced to the simple mathematics of who dies first. You fight with the desperate energy of someone who understands that this battle represents more than tactical advantage. It is a test of whether methods that once saved a kingdom retain their effectiveness when wielded by an older, more isolated ruler whose allies have become as frightened of him as his enemies. The Turkish blade that finds your neck carries no personal malice, belongs to no legendary warrior seeking glory through single combat. It is wielded by an anonymous soldier whose name will never appear in any chronicle, a man fighting for pay and plunder rather than ideology or revenge. In those final moments, as consciousness fades and the dragon banner falls beside you in blood-soaked snow, the last coherent thought is neither regret nor satisfaction, but simple recognition. You became exactly what your world required, a monster perfectly adapted to monstrous times, a ruler who discovered that survival sometimes demands abandoning everything that makes survival worthwhile. According to the chronicles of Antonio Bonfini and others, your severed head makes its final journey to Constantinople, displayed in Sultan Mehmed's court, as proof that even the most fearsome enemies eventually fall to imperial persistence. The symbolic victory provides closure for an empire that never forgot the insult of murdered ambassadors and forests of impaled prisoners. Your body finds burial in Wallachian soil tradition, conflicts between Snagov Monastery and Komana, though historians increasingly favor the latter location. The uncertainty seems appropriate for a man whose life existed in the space between historical fact and mythological fiction. The stories outlive the storyteller, growing more elaborate with each retelling until political calculation transforms into supernatural horror. Centuries later, Bram Stoker will create Count Dracula, a vampire whose immortality and bloodlust capture something essential about your legacy, while missing its political context entirely. The fictional monster is terrifying because he transcends human limitations. The historical figure remains more disturbing precisely because he demonstrates what humans accomplish when necessity, opportunity, and power combine without moral constraints or external oversight. Your reign poses questions that each generation must answer anew. When survival requires abandoning moral principles, at what point does necessary evil become indistinguishable from chosen malevolence? The forests of impaled victims have returned to ordinary woodland, but the capacity that created them remains embedded in human nature, dormant until circumstances again make systematic cruelty seem not only acceptable but necessary. The dragon sleeps in unmarked graves and disputed burial sites, but dragons never truly die. They wait in the spaces between civilization and chaos, ready to emerge whenever fear becomes more valuable than love, whenever terror proves more effective than justice, whenever the distance between protector and predator disappears entirely. The methods that saved Wallachia from foreign conquest ultimately consumed everything they were meant to preserve, including the soul of the man who wielded them. Perhaps that was always the price that had to be paid. Perhaps some victories cost more than defeat would have demanded. The wind through empty battlements carries no answers, only the whispered reminder that in every human heart lies the capacity for both creating and surviving systematic horror. The choice between them may be smaller than we prefer to believe.